Okay, this is the audio lecture for Chapter 4, Work and Wealth Inequality from the Matrix of Race. Okay, so let's start off with the learning objectives for Chapter 4, which are to describe the current patterns of income and wealth inequality, to compare various stock stories of economic inequality, to apply the Matrix perspective to historical foundations of economic inequality, and lastly, to analyze potential solutions to economic inequality. Yay, like find a solution. All right, let's get started. We have a largely capitalist economy in the US, which means that the means of production are held and controlled by private owners. So prices are set by the forces of supply and demand with minimal government interference. Or I guess that's true if you close your eyes and ignore the bailouts after the Great Recession that saved the banks and the car industry, or the trillions of dollars given away to corporations and industries like travel during the COVID-19 pandemic. Even when many families received their paltry $1,200 from the government, literally trillions went to cruise ships and airfare companies, the oil industry, and others who should be completely broke if capitalism was real in the way we pretend it is. In this country, it's like another stock story, like MLK said. Right? In this country, we have socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. So how come families are supposed to save for rainy days and live off their savings in hard times? But billion-dollar companies, many of which who paid literally nothing in taxes in 2019, don't have to do the same. It's crazy making. They have CEOs making billions, but they can't afford to pay their bills when they come due, and they can pass that off to the taxpayers. So the United States is, ironically, we promote this ideal of capitalism, but when you look at how the market actually functions, it's not a truly capitalistic system. It's more of an ideology or a theory of economic policy. So the United States is one of the wealthiest countries in the world and one of the most unequal. Capitalism produces class inequality with large numbers of working poor. And this increasing inequality causes lower economic growth. Social scientists use two factors to measure economic inequality, which are income and wealth. Income consists of the flow of all incoming funds. So this is basically the money you make at work each year, right? While wealth is the measure of all the assets you own. So like homes, cars, artwork, savings accounts, minus any sort of debt, such as student loans or mortgages. The bottom 40% of the population has no wealth and is likely in debt. When we bring in race into the analysis, we see another dimension of income and wealth inequality. Wealth has a greater impact on our lives than income because wealth also provides opportunities, right, that can make higher income possible. For example, access to education, which can obviously lead to, higher economic outcomes, right, or access to healthcare. So the poverty levels in the United States are another demonstration of the inequitable distribution of income and wealth in the U.S. So approximately 17% of all children live in poverty, and children are more likely to live in poverty than adults of any age. Children of color are overrepresented among these 12 million. They are approximately 1/3 white, 1/3 Latino, 1/4 Black, and 9% Native American and Asian American, according to research in 2016. The federal poverty line is $24,230 for a family of 4 per year. The official poverty line for one individual comes out to $16.50 per day. 1.5 million households with children survive on just $2 a day per person. This has more than doubled since the mid-1990s. So this isn't necessarily a historical issue as much as it's a current issue that's getting worse. So part of this has to do with economic restructuring and changing occupations. So today's global capitalist economy is different from the agrarian rural economy of the past. And as the economy has transformed, so has the workplace. The U.S. faces strong global competition for jobs and increased levels of international trade. Our work system, thanks to globalization, has shifted or restructured to a two-tiered system. From a manufacturing economy, where we make goods, to a service economy, where we serve each other for a living, or ask people if they want paper or plastic, want their food to go, or if you work at one of those awful places that makes you sing to customers if they give you $1. It's called service or customer service. And like I said, globalization made this shift from manufacturing to service happen, by offshoring and outsourcing industries and specific jobs overseas so they can pay workers less and make more money off of their labor. The jobs that stay at home are low-paying, part-time, and temporary, which provide far less benefits for workers, and so sociologists call this historical shift economic restructuring. And they argue that the three largest occupational categories today that are still left after this restructuring are healthcare, social assistance, healthcare and social assistance, sorry, that's number one. The two are number one. Retail and accommodation and food services are the other two. And so these sectors employ large numbers of white women and people of color. And those are basically the only occupations that kind of remain accessible, right? And as I said before, a two-tiered system means that in order to gain higher status jobs that pay with more benefits and security, you need a higher education. So moving on from there, different kinds of jobs come with different kinds of pay, credibility, and really retirement or any other kind of benefit options. So blue-collar jobs refer to occupations involving manual labor, like manufacturing or farming or maybe construction. White-collar jobs are often administrative positions, so places where you have an office or a cubicle. And pink-collar jobs include primarily sales, service, and entertainment positions. These jobs are called pink as they are gendered. The high-tech industry has contributed to growth in the lowest-paying jobs, even though the ones they have in places like Silicon Valley pay bank. But many of their jobs involve outsourced labor to save money, so they avoid paying worker benefits, including healthcare and parental leave. Outsourcing is a growing practice and is not limited to the technology industry as a means of cutting labor costs. It connects with the Marxist term surplus value, where your boss makes more money the less they pay you, which is why companies choose outsourcing. Like when you call a 1-800 number and you get a representative in India, it is because we're globally competing for labor. So Google could easily afford to pay people here to do those jobs. But if you work in a call center in the US and you make $15 to $20 an hour and get benefits, retirement, all that jazz, you're more expensive to the company than hiring someone in India for $5 to $7 an hour. No medical or retirement. So if you're all kind of wondering how people like Jeff Bezos of Amazon or the Walton family of Walmart got to be near trillionaires, it's because of the hoarding of profits and not providing workers with decent pay, retirements, medical benefits, or other supports, because it may cost them a little more. While it would dramatically change workers' lives, getting paid a few more dollars, having a pension to support them when they retire, having health care for their employment. So some companies offer these in limited capacities to full-timers, while limiting opportunities to full-time positions and largely relying on part-time and seasonal laborers. So this disappearing social safety net took place with the inauguration of Republican President Ronald Reagan in 1981. Benefit programs or social safety net policies that had supported workers and their families through hard times saw their funding slashed, which included financial aid and food stamps, two heavily relied upon programs. Reagan also cut taxes on the top income earners from around 70% to less than 30%, which triggered an economic recession. This paired with the shift of jobs from manufacturing, the stagnation of wages, and other structural factors related to globalization led to a predictable increase in poverty. Federal funds of public housing and rental assistance were also cut in half. And remember, this is why people are homeless, largely due to Reagan's cuts to mental health facilities that dumped thousands onto the streets to save money. And the high costs of renting and home ownership are, what the majority of homeless cite as why they became homeless in the first place. During Reagan's time in office, 60% of federal funds for financial support for cities were also lost, which put pressure on the poor who previously utilized all those sources of aid. So the evolution of welfare is another interesting history that is rarely discussed outside of a classroom. Welfare is a term that's used to refer to policies and programs that are designed to support people in great financial need. Food stamps, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid are examples of welfare. It is meant to provide a safety net for those who would otherwise be unable to meet the basic needs that they have for survival. Changes to welfare under the 1996 Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act replaced the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program with a new program called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. This was under the Clinton administration. So TAMF, for 61 years before TAMF, AFDC, right, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, gave very poor women and children assistance from the government. AFDC was not generous, right, and it only succeeded in raising 10% of children out of poverty. In the 1990s, up to that point before it was eliminated, up to only 10% of children. One of the greatest problems with the AFDC is that mothers lost all of their benefits if they started working. Even if their income could not cover childcare or basic, life necessities. And as a result, those welfare recipients were recast as people who could not take personal responsibility for their own well-being. The stereotype of an African-American welfare queen having children in order to collect benefits became entrenched in popular consciousness. In reality, the majority of those on welfare were then and are now white. The often concealed story is that welfare recipients now receive less aid and for a shorter period of time. They're also required to work 30 to 40 hours a week outside of the home to get those benefits. Pursuing further education in order to get a better job is no longer an option, making it very difficult for women to improve their future opportunities. So states now determine who's eligible for benefits, how much they can receive, and there's a lot of work requirements imposed. And so states can limit the number of months families may receive benefits. So many people receiving TAMF benefits are already working when they apply, but their jobs pay such low wages that they cannot make ends meet. Also, I should mention, TAMF being temporary means that there's a lifetime limit on how many years you can get aid from this program. So while some people say it's been successful in limiting the amount of people on welfare, others will argue that it hasn't actually changed the issues of poverty. Poverty has gotten worse in this time period. So Collins and Meyer's research in the book finds that even as government programs for the needy have been cut, they've also been expected to subsidize the income of the working poor and provide other safety nets, such as maternity leave. Most costs have been transferred to taxpayers, leaving U.S. workers with none of the protections that were once guaranteed by both the private and public sectors. So private corporations, rather than private citizens, are now benefiting from welfare. For example, taxpayers pay an estimated $2.6 billion to support Walmart employees. Why? Because Walmart pays their employees so little and avoids paying any benefits that taxpayers are financially supporting these employees with public assistance, such as food stamps, subsidized housing, Medicaid, and more. So again, a company that makes billions per year doesn't want to pay their workers, doesn't want to give them medical insurance, so it becomes a taxpayer subsidy. Right? And again, these are not people asking for a handout. These are people working full-time jobs, but their job pays them so little that they can't actually have a decent standard of living. So when we look at the concealed story of who receives public assistance, we find that the majority of the U.S. population, about 55%, receives one of the following government benefits at some point in their life: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, unemployment benefits, or food stamps. So census research looks at only a limited number of direct government benefits, but then other public assistance programs are taken into consideration with those previous programs. We see how much we benefit from government assistance, meaning there's so many other programs that we take for granted that are offered to either, more affluent or wider communities, such as veterans benefits, government subsidized college loans, tax subsidies, business subsidies, and more. So this kind of whole stigma about government programs and blah, 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 it's kind of interesting because it's really a dog whistle in a lot of ways, because it's basically saying, oh, it's fine to get benefits for people that, are accepted in the dominant hegemony. But when it's people of color, poor people, then, whether or not they should receive aid is pulled into question. And we have all of these weird societal theories to try and say that somehow helping people receive money to feed themselves is like hurting them, right? When it comes to economic inequalities, the payoffs for hard work continue to vary by race, despite attempts to curb racial and gender inequalities in the workplace. So when looking at race, recession, and recovery, women and workers of color are disproportionately disadvantaged by economic shifts. When these things happen in the larger economy, they also continue to face outright discrimination. Over the past 3 decades, people of color have lost more economic ground than white people, especially during the Great Recession of 2007 and 2009. So we can see that even when we talk about, large-scale social recessions, they aren't impacting everyone equally. It's like a compounded marginality. So when you look at income inequality by race and wealth, from 2005 to 2009, the household median wealth of whites decreased about 16%, while at the same time, the wealth of Black families lost about 53% and Hispanic families 66%. Class inequality grew within each racial group, as the wealth at the top 10% of each demographic increased. The greatest increase was found among Hispanics, where the wealth at the top 10% increased from 56% to 72%. Households with zero or negative wealth grew from 23 to 31%. And so when you compare that to Asian families, that was about 12 to 19%, or about 30 to 35% among Black families, and only 11 to 15% among whites. So while Asian Americans seem to be the least affected, once unemployed, they endure longer periods of unemployment than either whites or Hispanics, and at levels comparable to those of Blacks. So again, a lot of this, I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, and I know the book goes into this a little bit, but really the takeaway from this is how, because of the structured inequality in our system, when these kind of things happen, they disproportionately impact different industries. And since industries tend to be segregated, they tend to segregate or impact segregated labor markets differently, right? Also, when it comes to the wage gap, typically we talk about this in general between men and women in the U.S. that's hovered between 76 and 79 cents to a male dollar since about 2001. So among working women and men with professional degrees, the gap is even higher. It's about 67%. So gender and race both affect what people can expect to earn. And like I said, or touched upon before with occupational segregation, this is another important factor to consider because we work in segregated work industries, which contributes to wage gaps. Both white and Asian American men and women are more likely than other racial groups to be employed in management and professional occupations, which obviously pay money, have better benefits, all that kind of fun stuff. Women in every racial category are more likely than men of the same race to be employed in service jobs, while African Americans and Hispanics have the highest rates in service economies. In occupations dominated by men, as well as occupations dominated by women, there's a wage gap benefiting men. One source of inequality within an occupation is what's commonly referred to as a glass ceiling. The metaphor of a glass ceiling represents the limit to women's advancement within their occupation. So they can see the top level of management, but they can't break through the glass to join them. So women of color are said to encounter a nearly impenetrable concrete ceiling, barring them not only from upper echelons of power, but from middle management as well. Others have expanded on this metaphor to argue that many women face a triple glass ceiling once we take into account gender, race, and class. And when we compare the United States with other developed nations, we rank last in terms of workers' benefits. So the United States guarantees workers no paid holidays or other days off from work, no paid sick leave or parental leave, which is very different than the entire Western world. So the myth of the American dream is perhaps nowhere more deeply entrenched than in the institution of work. For hundreds of years, immigrants have come to the United States seeking economic opportunity and a chance at prosperity. Many are told that if they work hard, they'll be rewarded. For those who do not succeed, it's basically just their fault, right? It's believed they must have just been doing something wrong. In this way, the myth obscures the realities of social inequalities. Like the late, great George Carlin said, they call it the American dream because you gotta be asleep to believe it. If you haven't heard George Carlin's bit on the subject, I highly recommend it, but it's definitely not for the faint of heart or for those who do not enjoy the swears. But he is a master of linguistics and a great mind. But really, the myth obscures the reality. It justifies the system that we have today. So relying on stock stories we're told about economic success, we tend to blame individuals or their culture or for their specific or individual lack of achievement. The stock story of the American dream has become, quote-unquote, common sense for many of us, but it fails to consider the broader social context. Neoliberalism is a kind of complicated topic, but it's basically an ideology. It's like a stock story that's based on a theory called neoliberal theory, sometimes referred to as market fundamentalism. It's a functionalist perspective that shapes global economic policy today. So, according to the World Health Organization, neoliberal theory embraces individualism, free markets, free trade, and limited government intervention. I'm sure you've heard the term applied to politicians as, yes, they promote these policies that largely come from this ideology in what most people call the establishment, right? It's like a shortcut term for neoliberals. So most Republicans and most Democrats, and nearly all of the policy changes to social services in our lifetimes have been based on neoliberal ideology, except for those proposed by the neocons, which is like a whole nother lecture entirely. But yeah, just trying to contextualize the terms a little bit. So the neoliberal approach blames the individual and assumes that corporations and businesses should be free from national and global governmental intervention, right? They don't want policies to override their own autonomy, right? In order to pursue maximum growth and profit. More money, more money, more money. Neoliberalism also assumes that free trade benefits everyone, including all nations and their people. It assumes privatization of many government institutions can save money and increase efficiency. And last, they blame and assume, really, individual responsibility is the cause of economic inequality and that taxes are unfair. So this connects to those dominant narratives we hear all the time that are connected to neoliberals and their policies. We hear that America is a meritocracy and wealth is just the result of hard work and not just luck of birth, right? We hear that poor people are just lazy. They don't want to work. That's why they're poor. Another one of these chestnuts is the old one that discrimination based on sex or race is now illegal, so any unequitable outcomes are blamed on the individual or cultural characteristics. Like if there's a wage gap, it's only because white men work so much harder than everyone else, which of course is BS. It's really roofers that work harder than everyone else. So if a meritocracy existed in America, roofers, gardeners, custodians, teachers, right, what we now call essential workers, gas station attendants, grocery cashiers, medical workers, gig workers, package deliverers, right, people at Amazon, all those kind of people would make bank, right, if this was a meritocracy, if it was about how hard you work, how much money you make. Because they work hard. And the hard work is supposed to equal more money, right? So I'm sure there are CEOs that work hard, but do they work roofer hard? Like in the California sun in August doing labor on precarious roofs? I just don't think so. So neoliberals say that even if there was discrimination in the past, it will diminish over time. And they think if women make less, it's because of choices that women make to lead to lower pay. Like they just like making less money. No, I'm just kidding. Basically, that's a little bit overassumptive. But basically, they like to say that, well, women just decide not to go to college. Well, see, now that's complicated in a system where, if we're being real, everywhere else in the Western world provides higher education for free or at a low cost to provide access for their citizens and their workforces, end up better educated as a result, right? They have higher pay. And so then they can pay more into their tax structures, all of it. Everybody benefits. So when we slash funding for education, especially after the so-called Reagan Revolution, places like Germany didn't. They kept providing higher education. Like we do with K through 12, they do with college. Right? So as a result, Germany is pushed in front of the U.S. in technology, especially efficient energy producing technology, which puts them on the cutting edge. So you have these highly paid workers making components for phones and solar panels in Germany, because they're so well educated and highly skilled. And we can't compete on a global market with countries that subsidize higher education. As people choose not to go to college, if you're saying, oh, women just choose not to go to college. Well, if you don't have any family leave policies or policies in place that help parents be able to work and take care of their kids, the cost of childcare is crazy expensive, then how is that a choice to not go to college, right? There's plenty of people that would like to go to college. So if we didn't have to worry about paying for college, you would see many more people of working class getting a higher education. But as it is now, you need money to get an education. So neoliberals don't take that into account when they explain away the gender gap or the gender wage gap. So the real danger of neoliberalism is that it's an oppression-blind ideology. It sees the world in terms of individual choice and a level playing field, and that the economy and work do not work to any detriment of any group, which is just not necessarily fact. All right, so then Marxist theories really look at this from a different ideology. They emphasize class inequality, So Karl Marx examined the impact of economic change, such as the shift from land-based feudalism to manufacturing-based industrialization, in changing class relations and conditions. Okay, so let me break that down a little bit. Basically, he was a historical scholar, so he liked looking at patterns over time of change, and he looked a lot at conflict, hence why they call it conflict theory. But anywho, basically, he was trying to kind of see how the feudalism of the past had this thing where if you were a king or queen or, some sort of royal like duke or duchess or some crap like that, a lord or lady, then you had some sort of power, autonomy, you had land in a feudal system, right? And then who was everyone else? The serfs, right? The people that labored and worked for them, that lived in abject poverty. So basically what Marx was trying to say is that he saw a lot of parallels historically between the serfs and the gentry, right? Like the kings and the queens and then their subjects, and what was happening with capitalism, right? That the French Revolution came in, all the kings and queens got their heads cut off for a few years there. But then what happened after the fact was that the people that still had that kind of privileged power were able to buy the industries, were able to own the factories where people worked. So they don't have to go exchange their wage labor day after day. They make money if people show up to work. So that's that kind of idea of owning the means of production, right? He was saying that the people that did were basically very similar, that it became another kind of royalty, right? They own the company and you go and work for it. They get all the money and you get barely enough to survive. Actually, literally enough so that you have to come back the next day, so that you can't stop laboring, that you have to keep exchanging your labor for money, right? That's kind of the way he idealized it. But anywho, and he was, again, looking at this when it was really taking place. Like he was kind of at the forefront of this, looking at, hey, what are the consequences, especially when he's looking at factories filled with sweatshop labor, horrible ecological, consequences, and really just the kind of danger of the, lost limbs and other kind of circumstances that people worked in. So anyway, he was basically talking about how the product of a worker's labor is no longer your own, right? It's not that you go to the factory, make a product, and you get to take it home with you. You make something that you have no control over, right? It's sold by owners in the marketplace for their profit. So later scholars influenced by Marx argued that economic institutions kind of, and the competition in the capitalistic economy produced racial and ethnic conflict and inequality. So this leads to a split labor market where ethnic workers compete for jobs. Higher paid earners, largely white, get to protect their jobs and wages, often through unions, by excluding new groups like minorities who entered the labor market from the higher paying jobs, producing a split labor market. And as we look at the history of unionizing in America, we can see exactly that. When you apply the matrix to the history of economic inequality, this is an important thing to implement, to have that matrix approach to understanding economic inequality. Because, again, it assumes that race is inherently social, that race is institutional and structural, that race is a narrative. So if racial identity and all of these things they're relational and intersectional, and that we're active agents in the matrix. So using intersectionality helps us see a more nuanced and complex picture of the experiences of racialized groups. In the 17th century, in the American colonies, wealth landholding whites built plantations in which people began to work for others rather than for themselves. Indentured servants were brought from Europe, and they were legally bound to work for their masters for a set number of years, right? Usually like somewhere between 7 and 11. So slaves were brought from Africa, and they were initially indentured servants, but soon after became legally defined as property, or chattel, owned by their masters for life. Chattel slavery defined the children of slaves as their owner's property as well. As the colonies were established, slavery was widespread. Smaller numbers of Native Americans were forced into slavery, and some even owned slaves, but the vast majority of slave owners were white, and slaves were predominantly African. Both slave owners and the entire towns and cities profited from slave labor on southern sugar, tobacco, rice, and cotton plantations. Slavery was also closely linked to economic development. So slave labor, the wealth that it generated, fueled the Industrial Revolution in Europe and in the Americas. The textile industry depended on the low-cost cotton that was grown on slave plantations, and the wealth of the nation and its white citizens grew as a result of slavery. And so that income that came from horrible exploitation of Black bodies also was passed on from one generation to the next. Following the Civil War, poor whites in the South feared job competition from newly freed Blacks, and this concern led to the development of Jim Crow segregation and legalized discrimination. This allowed for Blacks to be barred from many jobs and be paid much less than white workers. The western lands taken from Mexico and native tribes were also offered in parcels to white homesteaders, as we discussed before. Mexicans dispossessed of their land were also reduced to sharecropping, tenant farming, and migrant farming, similar to what happened to Blacks in the South. Native Americans who lost their lands engaged in subsistence farming or farming for self-sufficiency, and ranching on small areas in which they were forced to stay. In the West, Asians were imported to work on plantations, mines, and the Transcontinental Railroad, but it was illegal for them to own land. So when you get to the Industrial Revolution and the shifting economy, throughout the 1800s, that Industrial Revolution gained momentum and caused a shift to the wage-based economy and the transition to capitalism. Jobs slowly shifted out of agriculture and into manufacturing in the cities. The majority of men and women of color remained in agriculture and domestic labor, the lowest paying and least secure jobs. People worked in largely segregated workplaces with people of the same race, gender, and class, similar to today. Hard labor was often unregulated and extremely dangerous, like miners who faced cave-ins. Unions are an important feature of this history, as they brought about changes in work, like child labor laws, health and safety standards, the minimum wage, welfare programs, income protection, unemployment benefits, and other safety nets, not to mention the 8-hour workday instead of a 12 to 16-hour workday. And thanks to unions, we have a thing called weekends. These unions were largely discriminatory, and part of their lost power in the 20th century was this division. Because if unions weren't split by race, then there would have been more people together in one union. And that's the basis of people power in order to stand up to owners. But when they can be split up or used against each other, then they have less collective power. It's important to note that work was often detrimental. People worked in deplorable conditions, even in the 20th century, right? You had the Triangle Factory Fire that was famous because basically of what happened as a result of it. It was kind of the basis of creating some safety laws in the workplace. But what happened was these women were locked into the factory in which they were working, and a fire broke out. And it tore through the factory. And the doors were locked because they didn't want women to steal clothing or to union organize. So some of the women chose to jump out of the top of the building or jump off the top of the building so that their families would have a body to bury. And it was so graphic. It was mostly predominantly Jewish women that were working at that factory. And so people described just these bales of clothing coming down. They thought people were throwing clothing out the window, but no, it was these women, their bodies. So anyway, it's a horrific situation that happened. That's why I included in your additional material that information about the connection from that to the more recent history, almost 100 years to that day, to kind of show that even though we talk about a shift from manufacturing to service economy, we still have manufacturing economies. It's just happening in different globalized areas, right? Where we're still getting all the products that are made through manufacturing. It's just that some of the sweatshop labor and some of the conditions are out of sight, out of mind, right? But it's important to understand them and understand the history to see how the exploitation of the past is connected to the exploitation of today. So moving on to the New Deal. In response to the Great Depression, Roosevelt and Congress passed the New Deal, which created federal minimum wage, Social Security, and aid to families with dependent children, the AFDC, the AKA welfare, right? In the 1940s and early 50s, President Truman's Fair Deal sought to protect workers from unfair employment practices. They also raised the minimum wage and provided housing assistance and more. Both of these deals were created unequally to serve whites more than people of color, as they were distributed in a discriminatory manner. In identifying the categories of workers to be protected, legislators excluded farm workers and domestic laborers, which accounted for more than 60% of working African Americans. The administration of AFDC was put into the hands of local officials who could choose who was worthy of aid and who was capable of working. The result was white women were more likely to receive aid than women of color. The GI Bill of Rights, passed in 1944, was perhaps the most far-reaching social welfare program in U.S. history. The legislation provided low-cost guaranteed loans for college degrees, new homes and businesses, job training, and unemployment benefits. It had an enormous impact on education and economic mobility, and was to a great extent responsible for the development of a large middle class. While it was touted as an egalitarian plan, and it did help create a new black middle class, the GI Bill also failed to challenge discrimination and in fact increased the wealth gap. Benefits had to be approved by the mostly white-staffed local VA, or Veterans Administration Centers. So Southern black veterans did not receive the same benefits as white veterans. Numerous other obstacles to equity existed as well, right? Since the schools were segregated, there was not enough black colleges to serve all the black veterans that were looking for higher education. Job training programs required the applicants have an employer that was willing to provide a job after the training, right? Which, due to legal job discrimination at the time, made this almost impossible, really, for the majority of blacks that were service members. And, housing loans for veterans were administered by banks, and the majority of banks refused to make loans to African Americans. So it's frequently the case that well-intentioned programs designed to benefit everyone can end up reproducing racial or gender inequality. And this is one of those examples. This is why we have to, so many of these structural barriers that, when you talk about, solving issues of inequality, all of these barriers have to be dismantled and dealt with in order to change and, kind of right this unequal outcome. So it wasn't until the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 that discrimination in employment became illegal. This includes race, color, national origin, sex, and retaliation. As part of a compromise to get the Civil Rights Act passed, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, was given no power to enforce anti-discrimination laws. 1/3 of the complaints filed in the first year claimed sex discrimination. The EEOC's lack of action inspired the formation of the National Organization for Women. And the Civil Rights Act also challenged the notion of a man as a solitary breadwinner. Prior to this, men were assumed to be married with a family to support, and middle-class white men were generally paid enough to support a family. With the Civil Rights Act elimination of many barriers, we witnessed a shift away from the notion that father alone was responsible for supporting a family, and we shifted to a model of the solitary wage. This meant a drop in wages, the increasing necessity for both parents to work in two-parent families, and more challenges for single parents. Not included in the Civil Rights Act was protections for those with disabilities. So in 1990, the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, was done to protect those with disabilities, making it possible for them to have access to jobs and participate more fully in public life. The ADA, quote-unquote, prohibits discrimination and ensures equal opportunity for persons with disabilities in employment, state facilities, and transportation, end quote. Under President Trump, the White House has removed all information about the ADA from its website, leaving many people with disabilities to fear their rights could be curtailed in the future. When it comes to the LGBTQIA community, people have faced discrimination in pay at work and have also experienced harassment and assault from coworkers and bosses. The statistics are staggering. It wasn't until a Supreme Court ruling on June 15, 2020, on whether the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also protects sexual orientation and gender identity that the matter was finally settled. The Supreme Court interpreted the Civil Rights Act to include protections for gay, lesbian, and transgender people. I should also mention that Justice Samuel Alito, Justice Clarence Thomas, and Justice Brett Kavanaugh voted against it. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964, discrimination still remains a widespread social problem. Discrimination in hiring is a huge part of that problem because just like with discrimination in housing and homeownership, these things traditionally lead to accumulation of wealth that are long denied people of color, especially African Americans. The disproportionate increase in housing costs since the 1960s hit the lower class and people of color. So, for example, many African Americans remain stuck in urban ghettos where jobs have disappeared. Not all discrimination is blatant. But if it's so covert and institutionalized, sometimes we don't see it. So, for example, most jobs are not advertised. Approximately 80% are filled without being advertised and rely on social networks. Those in occupations where people of color are already underrepresented tend to limit the number of people who apply, making it difficult for them to move into those fields. So during job screening, employers often focus on their recruitment efforts in white neighborhoods. And there's also been many experimental studies where various, races are recruited to apply for jobs and given near identical resumes. And white testers were twice as likely as equally qualified blacks to receive either a callback or a job offer, while even white applicants whose resumes said they were just released from prison were just as likely to be hired as Black and Latino applicants that had no criminal record. In another study, researchers sent out fictitious resumes identical, except for the names at the top. They invented applicants with white-sounding names, such as Emily and Greg, and those with African-American names, Lakeisha and Jamal. The authors concluded that a white-sounding name yielded as many additional callbacks as does an additional 8 years of experience. And they found the same statistically significant level of difference across all occupational categories and industries. Researchers have also found that having a Spanish accent reduces an applicant's chances on the job market. Additionally, since the terrorist attacks of September 11th, negative attitudes and discrimination against Muslims and those who are mistaken for Muslim have dramatically increased, including in the workplace. So when it comes to affirmative action, oftentimes people of color may be seen as tokens or assumed to be the beneficiaries of affirmative action. But in reality, they have fewer opportunities to develop the social networks that help people advance. Affirmative action was intended to curb discrimination and create a more level playing field. It argues that affirmative steps should be taken to realize more fully the national policy of non-discrimination. It is intended to ensure that applicants are employed without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. Affirmative action programs often establish goals, plans, and timetables in workplaces and schools where there's been discrimination historically documented, and where white women and people of color continue to be excluded based on their representation in the population. Arguments against affirmative action are generally based on their representation in the population, the way that people talk about it, the kind of flawed arguments about it. Arguments against affirmative action are generally justified from a very neoliberal perspective. The stock story that claims that discrimination is a thing of the past and that poor people choose to be poor, and that negative cultural characteristics are holding people of color back and women back from the workplace. So when it comes to, the kinds of discrimination in the workplace, firing is the most frequently reported form of racial discrimination. Wealth inequality reveals the lasting impact of our history of state-sponsored racism. Until we acknowledge the full extent to which people of color have experienced unearned disadvantage and whites have benefited from unearned advantage, we will not have the courage to implement solutions. Reparations are part of this dialogue towards doing better. We've already done it for other groups. In 1971, the U.S. government agreed to give $1 billion and 44 million acres of land to Native American tribes in Alaska. In 1998, Congress allocated $20,000 for each Japanese American survivor of the internment camps that were established during World War II. Recently, the movement for Black Lives has made reparations one of their central concerns, supporting their demands with a long list of reasons linking historical inequality to ongoing inequity and wealth disparity today. Many scholars recommend revisions to the tax code. This would include increasing the estate tax to help level out that playing field for those just starting out in the world. Heirs may inherit up to $5.45 million without paying an estate tax. And the estate tax for those inheriting more than $5.45 million is about 40%. While these taxes may seem significant, inheritances provide descendants with funds they did not earn themselves. Inheritance is one way that wealth and privilege is passed on over generations. The top 0.1% of Americans, so about 160,000 families, have an average of $72.8 million. Should that wealth be passed on? Should that be inherited? Should $67 million be inherited? Over $67 million of that, again, is not going to be taxed. So the Koch brothers are also an example of how you can get around some of these inheritance taxes by basically just donating money, right? Which makes them seem like philanthropists when really it's just a cover for not having to pay your inheritance tax. They had a deal like that where they got, basically their father's company was split up into chunks, and they basically got to circumvent hundreds of millions of dollars in losses of that inheritance by just donating the percentage that they made in interest from that money to charity for 20 years, and then they got all the money free. So that's a nice way to get around it. Plus, it makes you look like a nice guy because, look, you're donating money. But really, when you really look at it and you're saying, oh, wow, like someone like Bezos donates money, and it's literally like you donating $3, you start to see how, money to them is like a whole different thing when you're talking about billions of dollars. So researchers argue for a more progressive tax code, and these are historically proven methods for decreasing the income and wealth gap. They also suggest incentives for the non-wealthy to save and decrease debt through more regulation. Former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich argues that if we want a more prosperous society, then we don't need to look at other countries. We can look back at the Americans' history at, the time of prosperity in the 50s and 60s, right? It was a time where the rich were taxed at very high levels, often up to 90%, when higher education was free or affordable. So this creates more people going into the middle class. And he points out how the idea of CEOs and billionaires as job creators is ludicrous because it's people largely in the working class and middle class that buy the majority of stuff. And when they have money, they go out and spend it. They don't put it in the Cayman Islands or swim in it like Scrooge McDuck. With a progressive tax code, we can have all that Europe has: free healthcare, free higher education, subsidized daycare, preschool, parental and family leave, along with other social safety net programs that help many families. So again, for more information on any of that, you can watch his film Inequality for All or Saving Capitalism, where he gets into those arguments in much more depth. But just to point out that, we've created these systems historically inequitably. So we need to look at that reality and try and face that. Try to find solutions that actually can balance the inequities so that we're not reproducing them into the next generation.